Okay, so now that we've looked at several examples outside of Europe and several different examples in Europe where we focused on merchants and the role that merchant capital played in that sort of broader world economy or world system that existed from mostly focusing on the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, but in the case of the Islamic empires, we went back as far as 600 and 700. And in all of those cases, whether it be Ming and Sung China, the Islamic empires, the Hanseatic League, or the Italian city-states, although we saw a very dynamic economy that was dependent on merchant capital, whether it be the carrying trade or financial services in the case of Florence, in none of those cases did merchants really make that jump into production. And in the case of the Italian city-states, a lot of these sort of merchants got out of production altogether. There was often small-scale production, but it never expanded beyond that and into a kind of more commercial scales of production. So now we're going to look at when that actually happens. Okay, and the case study that we're going to look at is Lynn, Massachusetts. So let's just go to the slides here, and we're going to talk a little bit more generally before we get to Lynn, Massachusetts, about the role that merchants play in the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. Now, the key feature that made possible for merchants to eventually move into production emerged first in England. And it was, of course, as I keep saying, and you probably are getting tired of at this point, is the emergence of commercial agriculture on the English countryside. Right, that's something we talked about in week 2, and I've sort of mentioned in each video since as sort of a decisive reason why it doesn't happen in other parts of the world. Now, this system of commercial agriculture, of course, first developed in England and then was exported to Ireland, which was actually England's first colony. And of course, when the English start to colonize the Americas, specifically their colonization of what is today the eastern seaboard of the United States, from Georgia all the way up to what is now sort of Massachusetts and eventually Maine, you get English settlers moving in. Now, what we're going to focus on today is Massachusetts, so we're looking at the northern states where this sort of commercial agricultural model was exported. Of course, the southern states adopt a very different commercial model of agriculture that is based on plantation slavery. And we'll talk more about plantation slavery next week, although the focus will probably be on the Caribbean. We'll talk a little bit about how plantation slavery develops and what becomes the American South. We'll also talk about that when we look at alternative roads to capitalism, which will be after the sort of midterm break at the end of June. Now, the increase in labor supply from the surplus agricultural labors was not enough by itself to make that transition to the capitalist mode of production, right? I mean, one of the key features that allows this to happen in England is you have all these people who used to work in agriculture who are now available to work in other sectors of the economy. And these people eventually would become, centuries later, the industrial workers that begin in the 19th century and, of course, flourish in the 20th centuries. When we think of industrial capitalism, that's sort of what we think of, right? That kind of Dickensian, Charles Dickens wrote a lot about industrial England and sort of just the oppressive structures that existed. But we have a long way to go before we get there. So even though you have all these laborers that are potentially available to do something else in the creation of these sort of simultaneous markets, somebody has to take control. And it is merchants that are that somebody to take control. So it is a decisive moment when merchants begin investing in eventually taking control of production. And as we saw, merchant capital existed in all these other empires. In many ways, it was more sophisticated and dynamic. But because they didn't make that jump into production, you never got that sort of capitalist sustained takeoff that we get in Northern Europe. Now, when they get involved in production, they fundamentally alter the relations of production from the artisanal mode to the capitalistic mode. Now, if we look here, we can see, back to what these workshops were in the sort of artisanal mode of production, right? They sort of produced all aspects of the shoe. Again, here's another example of what a workshop would have looked like under a master craftsman. And moreover, these merchants were able to exploit patterns of uneven development, which is a central feature of capitalist expansion that we'll talk more about as the course progresses. Whether through uneven labor markets, right, where you try to find the cheapest labor possible, or seeking out and exploiting the cheapest sources of material, right? If you're going to, in the case of Lynn, Massachusetts, produce shoes, then you have to buy material for those shoes. And merchants were primed to find and source the cheapest way to get that material. They also bought in bulk, which brought down the price. And eventually, as I said, they would completely and utterly transform relations of production. They would essentially destroy the artisanal mode of production and move it towards commercial capitalism, and then eventually industrial capitalism. They rationalized the production process. So let's go again here in this next slide. We're looking at a case study of Lynn, Massachusetts, and we're looking specifically at the 18th and early 19th century. Now, I'm not going to get too involved in sort of the central characters of this story. For those of you that did the readings, you know who I'm talking about at this point. So what we're going to do first is, why don't we look at where Lynn, Massachusetts is. Here's a couple of maps. So Lynn, Massachusetts, if you look at the slide here, this is Massachusetts, this sort of orange state here. You've got Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, right here. Okay. Now if we go in a little closer, you can see here, this is approximately where Lynn, Massachusetts is. And this is Boston here. Right, so it's fairly close to Boston at this point. You can see how access to Boston is sort of central in the rise of Lynn, Massachusetts, in terms of its sort of production of what we're going to focus on today, shoes. So just a few general things to think about when we look at manufacturing and what will often become the United States. Initially, as we saw in other areas, there were impediments to the emergence of manufacturing as an important sector of the economy. And this was especially true in the colonies. And this was largely because of the success of manufacturing in England. I mean, one of the things that allows England to make so much money in the 18th and 19th century is because their industrial techniques allow them to corner markets all over the world. Right? And this is sort of where we get into this more capitalistic modes of production, where England is able to muscle in on markets, not just because they have greater military force, although that is part of it. And then later on in the year, we'll look at how, even though you get this sort of competition in production, that sort of military aspect of it never completely goes away, especially when we look at imperial expansion next week. So because commercial capitalism had evolved more in England at this point, it meant that manufactured goods in England were far cheaper in the United States or the American colonies before independence. The things that were produced in England were produced more efficiently, so it meant that they could undersell things that were produced almost locally in somewhere like Lynn, Massachusetts. Now, there were notable exceptions, as the readings pointed out. Iron was a significant industry in the colonies, and shipbuilding was also another notable exception. In fact, a lot of the merchant ships of the British and English merchant fleet were actually manufactured in New England at this point. Okay, so this was the reading for today. There's another sort of slide of what's going on here. All right, so I've talked a little bit about this last lecture and sort of the introductory lecture, but I'm going to get into it in a little bit more depth, and specifically how it happens in Lynn, Massachusetts. So as most of you know by this point, the defining features of artisanal production was that it was focused on a household, and it was often supervised by a master craftsman. The person who owned the means of production in this case, or owned the shop or workshop, if you will, also was the person making the product. In this case, as we're looking at, it's shoes. Right? So the household served as the basic economic unit, right? The master supervises skilled labor in the frame of journeymen, apprentices, and other family members. Sometimes the master would bring in a journeyman who had already apprenticed somewhere to help with production, or he'd bring on apprentices. Sometimes, especially if he had sons, those sons would become apprentices and hopefully eventually take over this sort of shop when the master either retires or died. Now, each artisan was skilled in all aspects of the trade. They used hand-powered tools. There was, as the slide says, a unity of conception and execution. Now, sometimes, if the master didn't have any sons, as we saw in the readings, in one case, a journeyman could marry the craftsman's daughter. And then eventually, probably he himself would inherit the workshop. And again, they did all the work themselves from top to bottom. And they usually sold to specific clients, and they were made for a specific person. This was sort of a local market, but it wasn't so much that they had a store where they produced a bunch of shoes and then put it in a store and then somebody would come in and buy it. What you would do is you would go to a craftsman and you'd say, I want shoes. And you tell them what you wanted, they'd take your measurements, and then they would make that shoe specifically for you. It does still persists to this day. It's incredibly expensive, which is why manufacturing goods was expensive at this point, right? They were custom made, right? For those of you who've ever bought a suit, most of us, when we buy a suit, we go into a store, we look at what we want, we try it on. Maybe they'll take the suit in a little bit to make it fit us better. But there are still people who spend a lot more money and they have a suit tailor-made. And you'll go to a tailor, they take your measurements, you pick out the fabric you want, and they make the suit specifically for you. That is an artisanal mode of production. And this is what defined most of manufacturing up until merchants take control and rationalize the production system. Now, sometimes these master craftsmen would look for sellers in local cities such as Boston, but mostly were producing for local markets. And payment was often not in cash. Sometimes it was sort of a barter system. They often got paid in provisions, even with shopkeepers who eventually would start buying shoes from local master craftsmen to sell in their shop. Often what they paid them in was other goods rather than cash. So this system sort of flourished in the 18th century with shoe production. It flourishes in various uneven forms in other industries, but shoe production is sort of the focus here, and it is one of the first industries in the United States that eventually rationalized itself on a more capitalistic form of production. So merchants or shopkeepers often bought shoes from local craftsmen to sell in their shops, but these shopkeepers would often move to other markets and cities, even beyond Boston, to solicit orders, right? These were traders, they were merchants at heart. So they had that sort of spirit of buying cheap and selling dear. So you had to seek out other markets. So initially they were still operating under these sort of that mentality of the kind of trading empire, right? Get something cheap in Massachusetts and then go sell it somewhere else where it's more expensive. Now, as demand started to increase, it was difficult for artisans to meet the increased demand because of the slow production process. So a lot of these shopkeepers, when they found new markets, they found that they just couldn't get the craftsmen to produce shoes as fast as they wanted. Increasingly, shopkeepers, owing to their trading spirit and experience, began sourcing the raw materials themselves. And this evolved into what is not exactly the same thing, but a similar method to the putting out system we talked about last class, where the shopkeepers would provide a lot of the raw material and then contract a local artisan to make the shoes. Now, in this case, it was kind of an in-between method, where the artisan himself still controlled some of the production process. He owned the shoes and he worked mostly on his own, but he was doing the work for a shopkeeper. He was producing more. It wasn't custom at this point. Moreover, even if the master craftsman wanted to produce more to meet the growing demand, he lacked credit to expand his operation and hire more workers or buy more raw materials. Merchants, on the other hand, and shopkeepers were in prime position for this, since they had far more experience in credit and had better credit ratings. Also, artisans often accepted payment, as we said, in kind, not in cash, right? So they simply lacked cash to go buy more material, and because they couldn't get access to credit, had no access to cash at this point, nor could they really offer anything in collateral. Moreover, shopkeepers cultivated political ties, mixing with politicians such as James Madison over dinner parties, convincing them that, among other things, to charter banks to provide tariff protection so their industry could grow and not have to worry about competition abroad, namely from England. Now, what is important to emphasize here is that when merchants start to take control, is that it's a commercial revolution that precedes the Industrial Revolution. What we are seeing is more efficient techniques of organization, a division of labor. These laborers increased in the 19th century as it progressed. Work, of course, was centralized in a factory. And what this meant was that they could supervise labor, control its pace, and own entirely the means of production, right? So if we look at some of the slides here, right, instead of having a craftsman make the entire shoe, right? That quote from Conception and Execution. What you would do is then hire someone to do one aspect of the shoe. So you would hire someone to do the leather work. Then you would hire someone here to do, say, the stitching. Then you would hire somebody to do the laces if the shoe had laces. You'd hire somebody to work and stain the leather, right? All of these people were paid much less and the process was much quicker. You could produce a lot more shoes. And of course, because these jobs were much less skilled, wages went down, which means production costs also went down. Now, the other thing that happens, let's just take a moment to recap. The artisanal mode of production's defining features were production to meet a specific local demand, exchange in kind, barter rather than sold, and artisans controlled the pace and intensity of work. Now, When we get a transition to commercial capitalism, you get a market revolution, transportation, urbanization. The merchant takes control of production and rationalizes labor in a division of labor. Now, this merchant capitalist aggressively sought out new markets. It was about perpetual expansion, which of course is a central feature of a capitalist economy. A lot of this was result of market imperatives, but it kind of embedded itself into sort of the soul and the mind of these traders, right? These traders were all about sort of hustling to find new markets. And what they did was translate that spirit of trade into hustling and finding new markets in the things that they were actually financing to be produced. And part of it was also a fear of becoming, if you looked at the example of Ebenezer Breed, right? Person who has a lot of success, but then it all sort of collapses and eventually they would see him sort of, walking drunkenly through the streets. It was a fear of becoming somebody like him. So when you combine that sort of market imperatives with that fear of failure or that fear of standing still or stagnation to become Ebenezer Breed, you can see why they were so aggressive. They supplied the shoes of southern plantation owners, their families, and they also supplied shoes for slaves. And not just slaves in the South, but also regular people in the North, right? People who were not wealthy. Prior to this, shoes were very expensive, right? You probably wouldn't have even bought shoes for slaves if they were still produced in the artisanal mode of production, right? So a lot of what they were able to do through the rationalization of production and the division of labor was to decrease the cost significantly. And because of that, they expanded, and they didn't just find new markets, they created them. And they created them through that reduction of cost. By reducing the cost, all of a sudden, a lot more people could afford to buy shoes as a commodity. And therefore, the market just expanded from there, right? So the key to this success also was moving away from luxury goods, expensive shoes produced by craftsmen, to cheap shoes produced in a factory system for a larger market. The product was cheap, so the wages were lower. Now, eventually, this system evolves into commercial capitalism, the defining features of which are the production is moved outside the household and centralized, eventually in a factory system. Wage labor becomes the norm, handcraft tradition altered by the division of labor, and the production is to meet the demands of the market at this point. Traditional work patterns give way to regularity. Here. The profits were then, of course, reinvested to expand their operations, to seek out more and more markets, to create greater efficiencies. And once you started rationalizing the production process and you started making and raising all this capital, that's when you got that transition from, initially, as I said, there's the commercial revolution, which rationalizes production, and eventually, with sufficient reinvestment cycles, you eventually start investing in technology. And eventually we get the sort of industrial factory system that most of us define and see as the key feature of what we think of when we think of something like commercial capitalism, right? So again, the reading goes into a lot more details of this, but I just wanted to sort of spell it out for you guys and focus on sort of the key concepts that we're looking at. Again, the key thing to remember is it's a commercial revolution before a technological one. The technological one emerges out of the change in mode of production to capitalism. First in sort of a division of labor, and then eventually technology is introduced and we get industrial capitalism in the mid to late 19th century. Okay, so that's it for most of today. What we're going to look at next class, let's go to the next slide here, is we're going to look at the state and imperial expansion and capital, and specifically the reading by Robert C. Allen, The Great Empires and the Americas, chapters 5 and 6 in the Global Economic History, a very short introduction. The other thing to remember also, prompts for next week. Why did some nations expand imperially and earlier than others? What forces drove this search for overseas markets? And in what ways was slavery central to the rise of capitalism? That's what I meant when I said earlier we'll look at sort of plantation and commercial agriculture in the coming weeks. Also, another reminder that tutorials will start this Thursday. There'll be more information sent out on Quarkus and Slack later. All right, that's it for today.